lacking no luster. A shining star sits upon a tree bedecked with rich ornamentation. A log wreathed in flame, not unlike the wreathed doors of homes illuminated by myriad strings of lights. Candles burn deep into the night as carolers go door to door. But in our tidings of comfort and joy, have we actually fallen prey to the syncretistic tendencies of the idolatrous human heart? The Christian holiday of Christmas, bearing more than a passing resemblance to many pagan traditions, has left many to question, should we celebrate Christmas at all? And what exactly is the relationship between Christmas and these pagan traditions? We are joined today by Dr. Glenn Sunshine for our first of two Christmas-themed episodes, as we explore the storied history between Christmas and paganism. Welcome to the Sword and Staff Revenant. I'm your host, Coleman Barber. I'm one of the elders at Proclaim Church in Bonner Springs, Kansas, and joining me today is Dr. Glenn Sunshine. Glenn is the founder and president of Every Square Inch Ministries, author of many books, and probably most familiar to our listeners as one of the hosts of the Theology Pugcast with C.R. Wiley and Thomas Price. Thanks for being on the show, Glenn. Why don't you give yourself a little brief introduction? Anything I missed?
Well, you hit the highlights. I'm a retired history professor specializing in Renaissance and Reformation Europe, also doing medieval. Um, I'm a senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. I've worked for a bunch of different ministries. I do freelance teaching and speaking, and I write, and that's most of my life aside from my family.
Great. Well, again, thanks for being on. So let's just jump right into the episode. This episode is actually the first of two episodes in a two-part series that we're doing on Christmas this year on Sword and Staff. And the reason I wanted to do that is because in our community and in the Christian community, there's been this popular, and it seems like it's actually growing in popularity. There's this view among some Christian folks that Christians shouldn't celebrate Christmas. Um, so you are a historian by trade. Can you tell us why are there Christians that don't want to celebrate Christmas?
Well, I think there are two main reasons for this. First of all, there's this mistaken notion that Christmas is a holiday that's basically stolen from paganism, that it's a thin veneer of Christianity tacked on to a pagan holiday, which historically just simply isn't the case. Um, the other reason, though, has to do with the Reformed world in particular, where there was a sense, particularly among the Puritans, that you shouldn't celebrate any days other than the Lord's Day, that any other holiday was not something you should do. And the argument being that God commanded you to celebrate the Sabbath, which they translated to the Lord's Day. And since there was no other command for any other holiday in the New Testament, you shouldn't celebrate other holidays, because if you did, if you had an annual holiday, it would overshadow the day that God specifically told you to worship him. And that would be a bad thing. So therefore, you shouldn't do it. At least that's the way the argument ended up ultimately being framed. I think there were other reasons for that,
Mm,
but that's the theological excuse they used.
yeah. Yeah, I'm familiar with a lot of that, kind of being in the Reformed world myself. Uh, I've heard lots
Yeah.
of arguments, and they won't celebrate even like Easter. And maybe Easter's the biggest offender to them. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, one of the things you have to realize is that a lot of the reasons that they give you for why they do what they do in terms, particularly of things like holidays, the way they read the second commandment, the way they do the regulative principle, all of those things were really responses to stuff in the 16th and early 17th century. And then they developed their theological rationale for it later. So what you're actually seeing, if you look at the chronology there, is eisegesis rather than exegesis.
Yeah.
which is something that I probably just annoyed a lot of your listeners, but that's the way it works.
No, you're fine. You're fine. That's kind of one of the things that we
I
try to
actually
do.
specialize in annoying listeners. You should ask
Well, we try
anybody
to
on the
do it at least
podcast.
once an episode
Yeah,
with at least half of the people. So,
yeah.
um, yeah, well, that's great. Thank you for that introduction there. So, um, before we jump into a little bit more on the paganism side, can you walk us through how the church has traditionally celebrated Christmas throughout history?
Well, that's actually a rather difficult thing to do because it all depends on where and when. Because it varies tremendously depending on region, depending on era. The Eastern Church does it differently from the Western Church. Italy does it differently from England. I mean, there are vast differences in the way it's done. In all cases, though, Christmas Day itself was considered a holiday. That is to say, a holy day. There's a period leading up to it known as Advent, which is, well, exactly how you calculate it is up for grabs, but it's generally a 40-day period before Christmas. And then Christmas begins in the Western Church, it begins a 12-day uh, feast starting at Christmas and ending at Epiphany, 12th night is the day before Epiphany. So you have this 12-day period that is the celebration of Christmas, and it ends on January 6th, Epiphany, which is the celebration of the arrival of the Magi. And along with that, it is particularly in the Eastern Church associated with Jesus's baptism. The idea being that both of these are revelations of Christ to the world. The revelation of Christ to the Gentiles with the Magi, the revelation of Christ in his baptism as well. So the overall, when you're talking about Christmas, if you really want to look at it from uh, the practice of the church generally, you have to look at it in a much broader sweep. You've got to
Hmm.
think about the time of Advent, this time of where you go back actually to a lot of the Old Testament, to the prophecies of the coming of the Messiah, and you place yourself in their position of waiting for the coming of the Messiah. And for us, it's waiting for the second coming. It's
Hmm.
our awareness that Jesus is going to return. And just like in the Old Testament, they were longing for the coming of the Messiah, we are longing for the return of Christ. The two sides fit together there in Advent. So there's a huge emphasis on the Old Testament, on the prophecies leading up to Jesus's arrival. Then you have the celebration of Christmas itself, which ends up being this 12-day feast period with a number of holidays inside that feast days specifically within that, and then it ends with Epiphany.
Yeah. Yeah, that's cool. I think that the idea of Christmas being more than a single day, maybe 2 days, if you do Christmas Eve services at your church or something like that, is completely foreign to most people. Um, but it sounds like, in from what I know as well, like a much bigger celebration um has been the norm. We're actually very, very strange in our time.
Yeah, well, keep in mind, we have to be careful about the word celebration here
Mm,
because Advent, this 40-day period, is not the celebration, it is a preparation.
mm,
We in our culture, we tend to think of all the Christmas parties leading up to Christmas. Then we have Christmas, and the day afterwards, the Christmas trees are out on the curb waiting for the garbage truck. In actuality, from the church's perspective, all of the period up to Christmas Day is a period of anticipation, waiting.
mm,
Christmas Day itself is the beginning of the celebration, which then lasts this full 12-day period. So we've really kind of got it backwards. We start celebrating before the day.
mm,
And then once we have the day over, or maybe we do Boxing Day, where we have the day after Christmas, but then after that it's over and we're moving on to other things. We're getting ready for New Year's or something. This is really not at all the way the church ever seen it. This is a very secularized vision of what Christmas is. It's all about the gifts and the parties and stuff like that. And once Christmas Day is over, it's done. Well, actually, Christmas Day is only the beginning of the celebration in terms of the way the church calendar is structured.
mm. No, that's really good. It reminds me a lot some of the things that we talk about on this podcast and something we've gotten into a lot, just kind of by happenstance because the subjects have lended themselves to it throughout this season is this idea of liturgical rhythms and liturgies being something that actually um, impresses realities upon the physical, like it's impressing spiritual realities on the physical.
Mm.
Um, and thinking about liturgies that way, uh, an idea of preparation for the celebration actually makes sense. But that's not how we see holidays right now. That's not how we typically see Christmas, as you were talking about. But if we understand holidays as holy days, as rooted in some sort of like liturgical element, there's a purpose behind it. And
Right.
we're moving toward that purpose, then it would make tons of sense that we would have 40 days of preparation for the event because that's what liturgies are. That's how they work.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Actually, 40 days isn't exactly right on that. It's 40 days in Lent. What we've got is
Yeah,
are the 4 Sundays. It's not, it's the 4 Sundays before Christmas
right.
that you count. I reversed my preparation seasons. I was thinking 40 days. Wait a minute, that's not right. Actually, in the Eastern Church, I believe it is 40 days. I'd have to double check that. But in the Western Church, it's 4 Sundays. It starts the season.
Well, I'm
So
just gonna trust
apologies, I
you.
got that one wrong.
I'm just gonna trust you
So
on that one. So
yeah,
we're just gonna say that's the Eastern
yeah.
side, and then some of our Eastern Orthodox listeners can, bemoan our inaccuracies
Yeah.
there.
Well, I may have gotten that one wrong, but I think that's right. And I know the Celtic Church uses a full 40 days. The the,
Hmm,
the old Celtic Church used a full 40 days. That's where I got the 40 days in my head.
hmm.
And some of the groups that are trying to revive Celtic Christianity still use 40.
Okay. Well, that's kind of a good segue too, because I mean, we think about the Celts; they were not originally Christian. They were originally pagan, right? So
Right.
that kind of gets us into where does this idea that Christmas is rooted in paganism come from?
Well, there are actually two sources for that. One of them is the idea that the date of Christmas was set by Saturnalia, which was a Roman holiday that was celebrated, excuse me, a Roman holiday that was celebrated around the solstice, which was around December 25th by the Roman calendar. And so the idea came about. This really, the first reference we have to this is something like in the 8th century. So this is 600, 500, 600 years after the date of Christmas is really settled. That much later, they start saying,
Hmm,
well, yeah, it was actually um, Christians were trying to compete with Saturnalia. They were Christianizing the Saturnalia holiday so that people could adapt from one holiday to the other, something along those lines. The problem is, this is, like I said, literally centuries after the date was settled.
hmm,
And if you actually read the sources of the period where they were discussing this, that has nothing to do with why they picked that date.
hmm,
So the first reason has to do with the date of Christmas. The second reason has to do with some practices that, particularly we in the Germanic influenced worlds, Anglo-Saxon, Germany, things like that, some of the practices that people associate with paganism. Those are really the two reasons. Now, the date of Christmas, let's start with that one.
yeah.
The date of Christmas really doesn't have anything to do with Saturnalia. It has everything to do with the crucifixion. So Jesus, now there was this idea within Judaism that important events happened at the same date.
Hmm,
So the idea is that, for example, the world was created during the month of Nisan. The Jewish calendar is lunar, and the month of Nisan occurs in spring. So the world was created in the month of Nisan. Abraham was called in the month of Nisan. Isaac was going to be sacrificed during the month of Nisan. And in fact, the Exodus occurs during the month of Nisan.
hmm,
So all these key events happen at that point. Jesus was crucified on the Passover, which is the 14th day of the month of Nisan.
Hmm.
Now, let's just start with how do you if you're a Gentile Christian, how do you figure out what day that is? You want to put it into the Roman solar calendar
Hmm.
from the Hebrew lunar calendar. So what they did is most people, the majority view calculated the 14th of Nisan as being March 25th. A minority group said that it was April 6th out in the East. Some of the Eastern Christians said, no, it's really April 6th. So we have these two dates out there, but most people are saying March 25th. Now, important events happen on the same date. So Jesus died on 14th Nisan. Therefore, the assumption was that he entered the world on 14th Nisan, which means, well, in the Jewish mind, you entered the world when you were conceived.
Hmm.
So he was conceived on 14th Nisan, March 25th, majority view, which then becomes the Feast of the Annunciation.
Mm.
Add 9 months for the pregnancy, you get December 25th.
Okay.
And, the fact that it aligns with the solstice isn't surprising because of the way the lunar calendar was set up. It was set up so that it aligned, it was primarily a lunar calendar, but it was also tied to the solstice. It always occurs roughly that time of year. It has to do, that's part of the calculation. So, oh, and by the way, there are some people in the Orthodox world who say that no, Christmas, the Feast of the Nativity, should be on January 6th, which we celebrate as Epiphany, but these are the people who said 14th Nisan was actually April 6th.
Okay.
So that's just simply that odd little factoid there
Hmm.
is a confirmation of the fact that what they're doing is they're basing the date of Christmas on the date of the crucifixion, and therefore the assumption is the date of the Annunciation.
Yeah.
So it has to do with Jewish ideas, not pagan ideas at all.
Yeah, it totally debunks that. One of the things you said that was just kind of interesting, and I don't know where we go with this or not, but talking about how it aligns with the solstice and how that makes sense because it's a lunar calendar. But also, I mean, it's like the guys who came and found Christ were probably astrologers,
Mhm.
so it's not like the idea of seasons aligning or stars
Mhm.
meaning something is foreign to scripture. It's certainly not the Jewish mind. So
Well,
I
yeah,
just thought that
and
was interesting.
actually, if you read Genesis 1, the sun, moon, and stars are given as signs,
Yes, yes, for the
you
marking
know?
of days and seasons, right?
Right.
Right.
Um,
So
yeah. So,
just
no, I'm
something to
not
think about for
advocating
folks.
I'm not advocating astrology,
Sure.
but yeah, I think that there's something there that we tend not to think about because in our modern scientific way of viewing the world, we don't really recognize signs or
Yeah.
symbols.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but that's a
Absolutely.
whole nother issue. Um, okay, so we have that. Then there's the idea that our Christmas customs are pagan. Um, now, in fact, there are some that are.
Okay.
Wreaths, Christmas wreaths. The early Christians knew about wreaths. There were wreaths that were used in Rome, and in fact, they refused to use wreaths because they were associated with paganism.
Hmm.
They didn't even use candles early on because candles were associated with paganism. Um, Evergreen wreaths were used in Norse countries as well.
Hmm.
In around solstice celebrations. We also have things like Yule logs. Yule
Hmm.
logs predate Christianity. They're old pagan things. Those are definitely pagan customs. Neither of which you will notice are absolutely central to Christmas.
Yeah.
Both of them are sort of seasonal things that we do, if we do them at all.
Yeah.
We put up wreaths as sort of a seasonal thing. It's not specifically Christmas. And if we do Yule logs, it's just, well, for whatever is, for that period of time. Not specifically a Christmas sort of thing. Um, but then you get Christmas trees. And the amount of nonsense I have seen about Christmas trees could fill volumes. I've had people cite passages in Jeremiah that talk about making idols and say that what's really going on there is a Christmas tree. No, it isn't. And the only way you actually get there is if you read King James. And yeah, even in the King James, it's really not what it's pointing to. I've had people cite Asherah poles. I've had people cite references to palm trees in Egypt, which is a little bit different from a pine tree. All of these kinds of things. In point of fact, the earliest Christmas trees, the earliest reference we have to Christmas trees is late 1400s.
Hmm.
It's not an early element of the Christmas celebration. It shows up in Germany in the late 1400s. It only becomes popular in England and therefore in America when Queen Victoria marries Prince Albert. He brings the Christmas tree from Germany. And once Queen Victoria has a Christmas tree in the palace, everybody's got to have a Christmas tree. And if the Queen has it, well, Americans may have fought a revolution, but they kind of like the British monarchy. And so Christmas trees became popular over here. Okay, so why did Christmas trees emerge in the late 1400s? Well, the best we can do in terms of tracing it has to do with what were called paradise trees. Paradise trees grew out of um, medieval mystery plays, in which the paradise tree represented the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil both. They were trees that were hung with apples or red balls representing apples. The apple was used because, well, the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was always depicted as an apple. And the reason why it was depicted as an apple is the Latin word for apple is malus, and the Latin word for evil is malus. You change
Ah.
the accent, same spelling, change the accent, you get evil or apple.
Hmm.
So in a kind of Latin pun, they depicted the tree of the knowledge of good and evil as an apple, a
You just
malus.
answered a question I've had for a long time that I had
Okay.
that I wasn't even asking, but I'm so
Yeah.
glad that you
Okay.
answered it.
So in any event, you now have these trees with red balls hung on them, actually, representing the paradise tree. And these were used in the mystery plays. They were sometimes set up in town squares, but then people started bringing them into their houses. Luther really approved of this. Luther really liked these.
Hmm.
And there's a story that I'm not sure we can really prove. It may be a pious legend, but the story is that Luther was out one night going home, and he saw the pine trees with the stars around them, and it was so beautiful. He wanted to sort of share this with his family, so he got the idea of taking the pine tree in the house, the paradise tree that is now being used as a Christmas tree, and putting candles on it to make it sort of like the stars shining with the trees there, and that's where you start getting lights on the tree. Like I said, that may be just sort of a pious legend, but that's one of the stories that does circulate. But the point is, you don't see these before the late 1400s.
Hmm.
This is conservatively 400, 500 years after this area left paganism.
Hmm.
There's no pagan connection to Christmas trees.
Hmm.
It's sort of complete nonsense. And so what you get are people who are sort of intrinsically suspicious of things, who are looking for devils behind every bush, or in this case, every tree,
Hmm.
and trying to find, to discredit or to well, I don't well, discredit is probably the best word. Um, Traditional celebrations of Christmas, which they've decided for some odd reason must be pagan,
Hmm.
when there's really nothing pagan about them.
So Christmas trees don't seem to have any root there. However, you did mention a couple of things that you were like,
Yep.
no, yeah, they definitely had pagan roots to the point where
Yep.
early Christians, they wouldn't use wreaths, they wouldn't use candles. because of their association. What changed? Why do we use them now? Or why did that become acceptable?
Well, because first of all, well, there are a couple of things, but I think the core idea here is a letter from Gregory the Great, who, when he was advising missionaries going north, what he said was, look, you're not going to be able to take these societies and just instantly convert them to Christianity. You're not going to be
Mm,
able to instantly eliminate all of their pagan ideas and things like that. So what you should do is you should go in and find their pagan sites of worship and establish churches on those pagan sites.
mm,
Christianize them because the people are used to going to these places to worship. So put a church there. They'll be going to the place to worship anyway. Make it a church. Use what they give you in the culture to give you doorways to bring the gospel to them. Um, Paul says in the book of Acts that God has not left himself without witness. In every culture, he has left himself witness to his goodness and so on. And so the fundamental idea here is go into these pagan cultures, find the things that are in them that are pointers to God, and redefine them, reinterpret them, and show them how they actually point to God,
mm.
reshaping the way they understand them in terms of Christian truth rather than the pagan truth or the pagan ideas.
Yeah. Yeah, it reminds
Excuse me.
me of
My throat's getting a little cloggy too. My apologies.
oh, you're all
Um,
right. It's
yeah. Now, there's a really important point to be made here.
mhm,
Well, actually, there are two of them. First of all, this is exactly what we tell missionaries to do today.
mm,
We tell them to contextualize the gospel,
mhm,
find the things in the culture that are compatible with Christianity, reinterpret them in light of the gospel, and use that as a doorway, as the entry point to bring the gospel into the culture. A really famous example of this is Don Richards' book, Peace Child. Okay. If you haven't read it, that's a worthwhile book to read. It's a great example of this process of contextualization and how it works. We have no problem with the idea of doing this with a tribe in Papua New Guinea. I don't understand why we have problems when we did this with our own ancestors. Okay. The second thing, though, that's worth noting is that J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and many others, but those two in particular, both talked about what they called the good dreams of the pagans.
mm,
They believed that pagan mythology, pagan legends, pagan ideas had connections to Christian truth. They certainly needed to be cleaned up, they needed to be purified, but there were genuine connections to Christian truth that were important to connect to. And in fact, that point that Tolkien made to Lewis on Addison's Walk on September 19th, 1931, I happen to know the date because it's 40 years to the day from the time I first heard and understood the gospel.
mm,
The point that Tolkien made there is that, Lewis was an expert in mythology. He loved mythology, but he said, as he put it, the myths are worthless. They're lies breathed through silver. They're beautiful stories, but they're lies. They're not true. And what Tolkien said to him, Tolkien and Hugo Dyson, what they said to him is, no, Lewis, you're wrong. Because what you see in Christ is like one of these myths that you love. It's like the myth of Balder, this dying and rising god. It's just like these myths that you love, with one important difference. It really happened.
mhm,
It's myth become fact. All these things that you see in these myths are pointing toward the time when it actually became true. These myths were good dreams pointing to an ultimate fulfillment that really happened in Jesus. And when that idea sunk into Lewis, It actually made Christianity not simply plausible, but something desirable, something beautiful,
Hmm.
something that he could really commit himself to, live for, because it took all of the things that he loved and suddenly made them alive.
Hmm.
And that actually is a critical part of Lewis's apologetic. He does the rational side, but he also does the imaginative side. He does the side based on an apologetic of desire. That's what Surprised by Joy is all about, longing. Um, so that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about looking into these pagan cultures and finding those things that have resonances within Christianity, reinterpreting them and using them. So that the wreaths taken from pine trees, now not unlike in Rome, they were laurel. These wreaths taken from pine trees are evergreens. They represent everlasting life. The Yule log, even though it's not directly connected with Christmas, is interpreted as representing Christ coming into the world as the light of the world. We're reinterpreting these pagan things in this way. There's a wonderful book called something like Tree of Salvation. Um, the book talks about the myth of Yggdrasil. Yggdrasil is the world tree in Norse
Hmm.
mythology. It's the thing that ties all the nine realms together. They're all connected through Yggdrasil. And Yggdrasil in the mythology, in the anticipation of Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, when the gods and the monsters and the giants all go to war with each other and basically destroy each other, and the world burns and everything is destroyed. Except at the beginning of Ragnarok, Yggdrasil opens up, and inside some of the younger gods and humans go in, and Yggdrasil closes and keeps them safe through the destruction of the gods and the giants and the monsters and all the world. And then Yggdrasil opens up and they come out and start the world over. Christians took Yggdrasil, and what they said is Ragnarok has happened. The twilight of the gods has occurred.
Hmm.
The monsters, the giants, and the old gods, they're all dead. And the cross is Yggdrasil. It is the thing that unites heaven, the earth, and the underworld.
Hmm.
And it has opened itself so that if you hide in the cross, you will be reborn into the new heavens and new earth.
Hmm.
The Yggdrasil myth is reinterpreted as a picture of salvation. And in fact, this is this shows up in, for example, the stave churches, the famous stave churches that you
Yeah.
see in Norway. They're built to look like trees.
Hmm.
If you take a look at their outline, they look rather like pine trees. And they have a central pillar in the middle for the trunk. If you look at the ironwork on the doorways, it looks like the myths that it looks like the ironwork is illustrating the story of Ragnarok.
Hmm.
Um, all of this book Tree of Salvation shows all of this stuff. They're taking the myth and they're reinterpreting it. And this becomes a doorway to the gospel.
Yeah.
Why should we object to this?
If you are enjoying this episode of Sword and Staff Revenant and want to support the show, then you can head over to swordandstaff.creator-spring.com. We have shirts and mugs in multiple colors, stickers for all of you laptop graffiti artists out there, and even a pint glass for your favorite brew. You can support the show and get something for yourself as well. Links in the show notes and on social. Thank you for your support.
They're taking the myth and they're reinterpreting it. And this becomes a doorway to the gospel.
Yeah.
Why should we object to this?
Yeah. I think it's interesting. I think that we're headed into a very similar place in our day and age because,
Oh, yeah.
I mean, Enlightenment thought is dying. I mean, I'm just going to say it. I'm not even going to try and support it. It's just obvious to me. And I think anybody who's got eyes to see it recognizes yes, there's like some dying breaths that are happening, but there are so many people who have just realized how empty it is, and they're turning all kinds of places. Ironically, I think if you look at, demographics in the States, you have a lot of young men like Gen Alpha and Gen Z that are turning back to forms of Christianity. A lot of them Eastern Orthodox, a lot of them Roman Catholic, because there's a lot of I don't know. I think there's a lot of beauty and there's a lot of form and structure there that they recognize that's missing everywhere else. But and then you have a lot of young ladies who are turning to witchcraft.
Right.
It's like a complete split, which is really strange. But
Okay, you
I'm
want to take it one step further. Let's talk about the Enlightenment side of it. Where would you see enlightenment and science and stuff like that? Well, where it really reaches its, well, I want to use the word apotheosis, is in the high tech world. And if you go to the high tech world, what you find are people who are approaching high tech as what I call techno pagans.
mhm,
They see in AI, many of the people who are working at really deep levels in AI see AI not as um, computer algorithms, but they believe that they're tapping into a non-physical, multi-dimensional consciousness that is trying to communicate with us. Many of
mhm.
the people who develop AI are actually doing what amounts to being channeling
Yep.
in order to get their ideas and do the development. There are high level people in government, military, tech, intelligence, really high level people who are focused on studying UFOs.
Yeah.
Oh, they call them UAPs for reasons which actually make a certain amount of sense. But they'll tell you that these are multidimensional beings who are attempting to communicate with us. They do not see them as space aliens. They see them as, well, what a Christian would call demons.
Yeah. Which is wild
So,
because the conspiracy theorists have been trying to say that for years.
well, but the point is, even in these high tech realms, the Enlightenment is breaking down and
Yeah.
it's moving into a kind of, although they probably wouldn't describe it this way, it's moving into a kind of paganism or
Yeah.
occultism.
Yeah. I see that
Nano
even.
computing, it's the same kind of thing. You've got the same
Mhm.
kind of theories going on there.
Yeah. Yeah. I was thinking about that even in terms of, like Elon Musk. He's a great guy in many ways. There have been many things I'm very thankful for, but he obviously is still, even though he might begrudgingly call himself a cultural Christian and was baptized as a Lutheran, and depending on your theological background, maybe he's apostate, maybe not. So, but anyways, one of the things that concerns me about some of these incredible advancements that he's making, I don't know if you saw, um, he just showed these robots that you can buy for like he's hoping like 20 to $30,000. They can do simple work tasks and things like that. And I was thinking about that, and that sounds nice. However, as long as that's rooted in like a fundamental denial of um like creation mandate for work, right? Then that will inevitably end up bad. It sounds
Right.
like it's gonna be a really great thing and it's
Hmm.
gonna free us up to do all these other things. But if you if that thing is created, if you purchase one of those in order to get away from work conceptually or the
Hmm.
idea of work, then you're actually like rejecting part of what you're created to do. And so, I think it manifests sometimes not even in these strange esoteric ways, but it's in these very application driven ways
Right.
that um this techno paganism sort of thing happens. It's like he can't help but do that because at its root he is a techno pagan.
Yeah. Musk is an incredible. I find Musk a fascinating individual, and not the least of which because you find very few people who are operating on that kind of a genius level who are as entertaining as he is.
True.
Yeah. I mean, I just, yeah. He kind of. yeah, the Neuralink is the thing that I worry about.
Oh yeah.
You know, where he's going with the Neuralink and some of the stuff he's doing there, because transhumanism is another whole part of this. A lot of cultists out there are literally talking, people who are dealing literally and know they're dealing with the demonic are talking about merging humans with machines as a way of ultimately gaining control over people.
Hmm. Yeah.
It sounds rather bizarre, but that's literally happening.
Yeah. Well, you know, and with a guy like Musk, and maybe this can be our segue back into to what we were talking about before, and um, you know, seeing almost maybe the desires of the nations and the ways that they've been reaching out, you know, in the past to these false gods, and but doing so in ways that link into some sort of truth. I think a guy like Elon Musk, you know, he's very out there driven. So like he wants to take human life multiplanetary and he wants to go to Mars, right? And that's actually a a a right ambition. I don't know if that, you know, that particular target is the right target, but the idea of expansion and conquering in the right sense is actually a good and right desire that God gave to us. And I think we see that a lot in these pagan cultures, right? They have this real desire to worship. They have this, they even have these, you know, little bits of the truth in their myths all over the place. And, you know, you're talking about C.S. Lewis and how he saw that. And I'm sure you've probably at least seen or maybe even read Lou Marcos has a whole book um based off of that concept where he goes through all the different I think it's just Greek myths. It might be more than that, but I think it's just the Greek myths and he links them into, you know, this is how this links into biblical truth. And how this is fulfilled in Christ. These myths, they're fulfilled in Christ. And I think we see those kinds of things. Like Musk wants to go out there because that's where we're meant to go. You know, it's
Maybe.
because the gospel is um I'm not saying necessarily we're supposed to go there um in the typical human way, I suppose, but the gospel is this redemptive program for the cosmos, right? And so there is a desire that somebody like Musk has, I think, for the cosmos. Um Now he's not, you know, in my estimation, he's not a Christian, obviously. He denies Christ, and so there's that, but I think that we see that kind of thing, and I think that if Christians want to start reaching out to this coming world, I don't even want to say generation because I don't think it's a generational thing. I just think it's just like a breaking down of what we've had, and something new is happening. I think we need to start thinking in those terms and not so much, hey, I just need you to know about the Goldilocks zone. Although that's a great apology for the design that God has in the universe. We
Mm.
need to start thinking more imaginatively.
Well, I would suggest that we might be better off fulfilling the creation mandate to subdue the earth.
Mm,
There, you know, just as a simple example, my son-in-law comes from Sierra Leone.
hmm
Sierra Leone is the poorest country in Africa, the 13th poorest in the world. And to put what poverty looks like in Sierra Leone into perspective, um, 1 in 8 women die in childbirth there, and 1 in 5 children die before the age of 5.
mm,
When we were there, my wife worked at a pop-up medical clinic, and she was an RN. Every person who came in with a fever, she tested for malaria. They all had it.
mm,
The most that they could do for most people was give them Tylenol
mm,
because they had no medicine. And when they ran out of Tylenol, my wife said, "Wait a minute, I've got some in my purse." She had a little thing of Tylenol in her purse. And that enabled them to, quote, treat 2 or 3 more people.
mm,
That is the kind of poverty that you're facing in Sierra Leone.
hmm
My question is, are we fulfilling the creation mandate by going to Mars while we're dealing with things like that on Earth?
Hmm, that's a good question. That is yeah, that's a really good question. It is fun to be excited about rockets, but we have things to fix here at home.
Right. Yeah, no, I don't, Musk is answerable to God. He's not answerable to me. But my question, when you're saying, it's our, it's what we're meant to do um, to redeem the cosmos. My first thought is God gave the earth to man. Maybe we should really be thinking about this planet.
Hmm, that's good. Well, people didn't sign up for a sermon, but they got it tonight, so
No.
that's good. That's good.
Yeah, yeah. It's one of the problems with podcasts. You never quite know what you're going to get.
No, we love it. That's the fun of the podcast, right? So, because we came in here talking about Christmas, we talked about rockets and poverty. So,
Yeah.
it's good stuff. Um, so kind of linking then back into what we were talking about before, and that idea of um linking in with the cultures that we go into. Some people are very concerned about the idea of syncretism. How has the church viewed that kind of thing traditionally? Is that concern like a new concern, or has that always been a concern? And how has that affected the way that we do these things?
The church has generally been aware of the danger, and it has always tried to, well, for lack of better words, it's always tried to police that. I mean, it is in fact a real danger. The question becomes whether what you are doing is expressing the gospel in cultural terms or bringing the culture into the church. And those are two different things. The what Gregory the Great and the missiologists and things like that, what they're looking to do is to take the gospel and find the ways to express it in terms that communicate best and that are best understood within the culture without compromising it. What happens with syncretism is when you bring in things from the culture that don't really fit into Christianity and you squeeze them in anyway. And that's what you've got to avoid. The two of them really, though, are different processes. In the one case, like I said, you're just simply adopting things that are in the culture and bringing them in the church because it might be in the name of reaching the culture, but they don't really fit. And in the other case, it's you are reinterpreting their culture in light of the gospel. The directionality of the two are, it seems to me, are very different.
So would that be something like, let's take the Yule log, for instance. And maybe I've got my history wrong on the Yule log. Um, but the using it to address the culture with the gospel would be something like what you said, where the Yule log is representative of the light of Christ,
Mhm.
shining in the darkness, versus other understandings of the Yule log would deal more with signs about prosperity in the coming year sort of thing. Like the
Mhm.
how many sparks come off the log is how many pigs you're going to have in the year sort of thing. I think is the way that I've heard it phrased.
Yeah. Well, actually, the Yule log was more typically the kind of bonfire trying to summon the sun back
Mm,
in the darkest time of the year. And there may have been games associated with it, like with the sparks and things like
hmm
that. I haven't actually run into that one. But yeah, something like that would be the problem.
hmm
Now, actually, as long as you understand it as a game, I don't have much of a problem with the spark thing.
Yeah.
But as long as it's a game. If you're taking it seriously,
Right.
as a kind of fortune telling or something like that, that's a different animal.
Yeah.
And and in fact, there are always problems with that too, because
hmm
people always bring those kinds of things in as well. But
Sure.
those are typically fairly low grade superstitions.
Right.
The bigger danger is when you look at Well, okay, let me give you a concrete example. Um, the Aztecs had, well, they were an incredibly bloody religion that
Mm-hmm.
they had. There was it seems, a female death goddess,
Mm.
most of their gods dealt with death, it seems. Um, when Christianity came to Mexico, it appears that there was a certain survival of this Aztec death goddess that was brought into folk Catholicism
Mm.
in a kind of truly syncretistic way.
Mm-hmm.
And this kind of emerged publicly only really in the 1940s, and only got really, public much later than that, as Santa Muerta,
Mm.
Saint Death, which really looks in a lot of ways like a parody of Santa Maria to me.
Mm-hmm.
You know, this has now escaped the confines of folk Catholicism in Latin America and is the fastest growing new religion in the United States, and for that matter, the fastest growing new religion in the world.
Mm.
But it existed for a time within Mexican folk Catholicism.
Mm.
So that would be an example of syncretism. You
Yeah.
don't want that.
Right.
Okay. Um, on the other hand, uh, there are churches in Latin America that have, that date back to the 17th century, that have wall paintings where the cartoons, the outlines of the painting, come from missals that were printed by Christophe Plantin in the Netherlands, in Antwerp. And the illustrations were done by Peter Paul Rubens, woodcuts. And so the woodcuts were reproduced, the cartoon, the outlines were reproduced on the walls of the church. They were painted using Latin American, Native American color schemes. So
Mm.
they look absolutely nothing like anything Rubens would have done.
Mm.
But you've got this combination of Rubens' 17th century clothing and all of that on the walls there, painted in Latin American colors,
Mm.
in the indigenous color schemes.
Mm.
By our eyes, it looks, if you know anything about art history, it looks truly bizarre. But it was an example of the two cultures kind of blending. And there's nothing really wrong with that one.
Yeah.
But when you start bringing in the theology, the beliefs, from the previous religion, and trying to incorporate them into the church,
Right.
that's a problem.
Right. Yeah, there's a difference between trying to bring them in to influence Christianity versus bringing Christianity in to influence them. And I
Right.
think that's the key. And seems to be the big piece about, that's the suspicion. And I don't imagine that, us talking through the roots here of different aspects of Christmas are gonna sway people who are suspicious already, things like that. But I think that that's where the suspicion comes in, is like there are real dangers. If we were to bring in Christmas wreaths and um, link them back to the wrong things, then yeah, that would be a real problem. But
Yeah, it would be, but the problem is we've completely lost any kind of memory of what these things actually connected to.
mhm,
The only memory that we have is their Christian meanings,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
or just sort of the traditional meaning that we put up a wreath on the door at Christmas time.
uh-huh,
Yeah.
right. So is the answer then to understand the original meanings better, or is the answer then to say, well, Christianity won, and we kind of claimed that for Christ.
I would say it's the second, and I would add to that one other thing.
Hmm.
As a culture, we are becoming increasingly rootless.
Mm,
And people who are rootless are really adrift in a lot of ways,
yeah.
and in a lot of very unhealthy ways.
Hmm.
I think that there is a great deal positive to be said about traditions,
Hmm.
especially traditions that you can anchor to the faith. But in the absence of tradition, we, number one, don't really know who we are.
Mm,
But number two, we are also susceptible to every new fad, every new thing, every new idea that comes along.
yeah,
Tradition has a way of keeping us anchored in truth and thus less susceptible to whatever is blowing around in the culture. Um, tradition can become dead and all of that sort of thing, but I don't think in our case that's really the danger. The danger for us is being unrooted to anything. And so I think that connecting into tradition, building tradition, tying into our history, tying into our past. Now, there's stuff that we do want to reject because not everything in the past is good,
sure.
but linking into these things, linking into the rhythms of the year, sacred time, linking into various rituals, traditions, things like that, are a way of helping us be better anchored into our faith rather than being blown back and forth by every wind of doctrine and
Mm,
stuff that comes along.
mm,
I think that that is actually incredibly important to us right now because we are in a culture that wants us to be rootless, that
hmm.
wants us to be um, disconnected from anything because then it can remake us into its image.
Yeah. Well, and we definitely are rootless in many ways. I know, for myself, I kind of, and I'm not saying it's the answer to all things, but like I sort of stumbled my way into the reformed world and stumbled into some tradition and things, and I don't accept everything in that world, but it certainly gives more roots. It gives more roots than just kind of generic, just out there kind of doing whatever you want sort of Christianity. Um, but I think I think you're right that we are fairly rootless, and I think a lot of that's purposeful. And I think there's a lot of change that's on its way, and I think that's also purposeful too. We've been talking about it the whole night, how there's a shift that is happening away from the traditional Enlightenment style materialism into, the techno paganism or straight paganism or any other form of um, religious expression, seems to be on the table for a lot of people where it wasn't before. And I know that our goal in this podcast is to help walk people through those things, be prepared for those things, and have some roots. And I know that you're also going to be starting something very similar. So maybe we can shift a little bit here with as we kind of come towards the close of this episode, and you can tell us a little bit about what it is that you're doing in this space. I don't know what to call it: re-enchantment,
Yep.
disenchantment.
Yeah. I'm going to be doing a series of videos through my Patreon and hopefully through the website as well on on this problem. Um, I won't give you the whole outline of the series, but what I'm going to do is talk about the way people looked at the world in the Middle Ages, working to some extent off of Lewis's discarded image, where we had a sense of the world as a place that was meaningful. We tend to look at the world as a place of fact. We don't look at it as a place of meaning.
Mm,
The physical universe has meaning. It isn't just a bunch of facts. They understood this in the Middle Ages. They did some crazy things with it, but they had a good grasp of that. Then you get to the Enlightenment, and this is all cut off. The world becomes, in our minds at least, it becomes just a bunch of facts. It becomes stuff to be used and manipulated and so on, and meaning is lost. And once that happens, you enter a period that sociologists call disenchantment.
mm,
The world becomes disenchanted. And when that happens, there's a whole spillover set of consequences to culture and to us. And people recognize pretty early on that in a disenchanted world, there's no purpose, there's no meaning, there's no nothing, and people don't can't really live with that. So from there, I'm going to go through the efforts that people have made to re-enchant the world, starting all the way back in the 19th century with the development of Western occultism, spiritism, stuff like
Mm,
that, through the New Age movement into these various forms of paganism. All of this is what I would describe as dark enchantment. And then we're going to finish up with some things on what a proper re-enchantment of the world, a Christian re-enchantment of our worldview should look like. What are some elements of that? So this is going to be a long series of
yeah.
videos, video teaching on all of these subjects.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that sounds awesome. I'm certainly looking forward to it. It kind of sounds like, if somebody asks you, well, what am I going to cover? Your answer is sort of, well, all of it. Just gonna just cover it all. So that's really exciting to hear. And I've seen that, because I listened to the podcast and even the last few episodes, over the past month or so. It seems as though you guys have started to really take seriously that this is a thing that needs addressed, and I've appreciated that because I think that there's a lot of guys who are how to say this of your generation who maybe
Old
don't.
guys.
I didn't say old guys, all right.
Yeah.
But who would really shy away from that.
Well,
And I think it's
well,
important. We need guys like you to
well,
actually take on that work.
yeah. Well, there a couple of comments on that, just sort of on a personal level. I realized a while ago that as someone who is a historian and is in the reformed world and all of that sort of thing, I am in a position where I can talk about these things in a way that someone coming out of let's say, a charismatic or a Pentecostal background, I will be heard in a way that they wouldn't be. And
Hmm.
I realized a while back that I really need to be working on helping Christians develop a supernatural worldview to
Yep.
recognize that the world is bigger than what we see. Um, this is something that has actually interested me for a very, very long time. When I went into Trinity Evangelical Divinity School back in the, well, 1980s, um, before you were born, probably, back
I
in
was born in 88,
83.
so
Pardon me?
I was born in 88, so just
Yeah, so
barely
five
before.
years before you were born, I spoke to John Woodbridge, who is the head of the department. I told him I was thinking at that point of working on a history philosophy degree. And what I was interested in doing already at that point was doing something on what I would now describe as the new spirituality, sort of the
Mhm.
new age movement in those days. Because I was convinced at that time, and I'm still convinced, that the draw of it is that already at that point, I think people were realizing, at least people on the fringe were realizing that secularism was a dead end and that they were looking for spiritual reality and spiritual power and also, I suppose, autonomy.
Mm,
And they thought that Wicca and New Agey stuff and things like that was the route to get it.
mm.
So I believed that in 1983. I still believe it.
Yeah.
So this has been a long time coming.
Yeah.
And the other part of it is back in the 70s, I I had my first encounter with what I think in sort of normal parlance would be a haunting.
Mm.
And I actually, as a kid, I performed a, well, I don't know whether you'd call it an exorcism or what, but it ended it.
Yeah.
And this was in the house that I lived in. So I've been aware of supernatural phenomenon and things like that literally my entire Christian life.
Yeah.
So all of these things mean that this is, all of this is part of my background. And, I this is the point now at this point when I'm much older,
Mhm.
where I really feel like right now there's a critical need for some solid information and teaching on this stuff. So I'm just going for it.
Well, that's awesome. And I agree. I think there's a big need there. I think right now there's sort of like a giddiness, and I don't think it's a bad thing either. But I think that there's a giddiness and a fun, like, oh, hey, this stuff's real. And supernaturalism is starting to like come back in vogue. And, we can actually tell the ghost stories now, that sort of thing. And I don't think that's bad. I think that's actually been missing. But I think that, guys like you, I know I personally have had some interesting experiences as well. And I think a lot of folks who listen to our podcast who are Christians have also experienced those kinds of things. And that's why they listen. That's why they want to talk about
Mhm.
these things. They want to have somewhere to like put those experiences and understand those things. And so I think a work like this that's actually going to put those things in historical context and help people keep their heads screwed on straight as I think more of those things start to happen and more people have those experiences and people start taking those experiences seriously and not just throwing people in insane asylums, frankly. That kind of work is going to be really pivotal. So I appreciate that you're doing that. I'm glad to see that somebody that I would qualify as a heavy hitter is jumping in the fray here. So really appreciate the work that you're going to be doing. So with that, why don't we wrap things up here? Can you tell us and tell everybody who's listening where they can find you and find your work?
Okay, well, there's the Theology Pugcast, of course.
Yep.
And then along with that, my website is e square inch, ESQUAREINCH.org. My ministry is called Every Square Inch Ministries, from the quote from Kuyper. And yeah, that's probably the best place to find my stuff. I try to, anytime I publish something or get something, this podcast will show up there. Anytime I have any kind of internet presence, it shows up on that website. I'm also on Twitter and Facebook, and I will probably be on Instagram pretty soon too with the website.
Great. Well, I'll make sure to link all those things in the podcast description for this episode when it launches in December. Um, as everybody knows, links to social media, merch store, our Discord, which you are more than welcome to join if you want to get into some weird conversations. Our Discord, that'll be in the podcast description as well. And just remember, if you enjoyed the episode, share it, make sure to give it a good review so other folks can find it as well. And thanks for listening and stay tethered.
Bye bye.